You wouldn't be alone feeling that Middle-earth feels different somehow from other fantasy worlds. Take Wheel of Time, Game of Thrones, Harry Potter, Star Wars, Malazan, Book of the Fallen, Discworld, all the like. The Lord of the Rings feels like such a different story. There's this different sense of weight, deep sense of history, and throughout the entire story, alongside the victories and triumphs, there's a deep sense of loss and sadness. There's this price and tragedy that seems to really stand out when compared to these other fantasy worlds. And it was a revelation to me some years after reading Harry Potter to understand that at the heart of the books, at the heart of the stories, they were essentially mystery novels. You could make the argument definitely for mystery adventure, but the main magnetism that drew people into this world was the mysteries. Who was trying to steal the Philosopher's Stone? Who was the heir of Slytherin? How did Sirius Black escape? Who was the Half-Blood Prince? I remember this scene, listening to it on audiobook by that great voice actor Jim Dale, I believe it was, and he's describing as Harry's looking at the Marauders map, following after Barty Crouch through the halls of Hogwarts, and who should he find? Professor Moody. What did it all mean? What's the explanation? I had to find the answers. So of course, I blitzed through the entire novels reading them. But whenever I think of great mystery novels, I think Agatha Christie, Conan Doyle, not necessarily Harry Potter. But this summary and this label did help me understand why the books drew people in so much. People who never read books consume them faster than anything else. And what pulled them in? Answering this question as a storyteller, trying to figure out why people and myself, why I love them so much. And what made the world of Harry Potter feel like Harry Potter, because it feels unique. The mystery, the intrigue, the magic, the potential, a world that feels so real that you can't wait to explore the mystery. And I had a similar revelation and realization about Lord of the Rings and why there's very little else that I've read that feels similar to that kind of story. The world, everything feels so different. Now, it is always unfair to compare things to Tolkien, but the main thing I realize is that Lord of the Rings is a tragedy. Or more specifically, I guess you would call it, it exists in a post-tragedy world. The story itself doesn't end horribly for the characters. There's not a bad ending. The good guys win, but there's a strong sense of this tragic and mournful feeling throughout the entirety of the story. The entire quest of the Fellowship feels like a grand tour through a dying and hollow land of once great kingdoms. There's such an empty feeling. The world was so grand. It used to be filled with mighty kings who led their people in peace and prosperity against evil. But now, in the shadow of Mordor, there's barely a hope it will change. There's barely a chance that it's seemingly that the good will triumph. But there is a chance. Let me know what your favorite kingdom or place in Middle-earth is, and comment down below. And please do like the video. It very much helps in the algorithm. And let's get back to the video. If you've ever read The Children of Hurin, you'd understand that Tolkien understands the tragic genre very well as his expertise in ancient literature, where tragedies held a much higher place than they do today. Nowadays people don't really care for those types of stories. It's a hard genre to work with, which is why so many stories focus on genres that better appeal to mass audiences. Things more like murder mysteries, heroic action adventures, superheroes, or romantic comedies and so on. And while it's understandable, most audiences want to feel that when a story ends, they want a sense of closure, of success, that a journey was worth it. They want to know the story they just read was actually worth it. They want a happily ever after, because that's what they want for their own life. If you get to the end, everyone's dead and it all falls apart and everything's worse for the while, there's a question of why we even went through all this to begin with. What's the point? And this is what makes The Lord of the Rings so interesting, is because Lord of the Rings is two parts. It is a continual mournful telling of the fallen lands of Middle-earth, while at the same time showing us a glimmer of hope, a fool's hope, if you will, that the great kingdoms can return. It's this sadness followed by this promise that it may return. And more so, ultimately, this is something you'll notice with all of Tolkien's stories, is that he tells his tale without cynicism. In this modern day of ours, there's no really truly heroic person. Anytime somebody talks about the good old times, there's this internal eye rolling that feels instinctual. For us, there's only those who appear heroic until their darker deeds or secrets come to light. That a celebrity you like and admire is only one scandal away from being revealed to be a degenerate leech. And there's no one to look up to. Not so in Middle-earth. This is what makes it that longing to return to the great kingdoms all the more powerful, because it's so sincere. Ask yourself the question, would you like to live in a kingdom ruled by Aragorn? Would you like to explore the mines of Moria, live there, work alongside the dwarves in the glory of Durin's reign, before everything went to crap? Or live in Rivendell, the house of Elrond, to live in Lothlorien, to see these wonderful places? All of us would leap at the chance if you had the opportunity. From the onset of leaving the Shire, the hobbits in the trilogy, The Lord of the Rings, are traveling through this lordless and unlawful land, chased by the dark fallen kings of old, the Nazgul, the Ringwraiths, the once great leaders of man, and wisest and most powerful, now serve the enemy himself, Sauron. The hobbits in their journey come across a party of elves who are leaving Middle-earth forever, and it has this tragic, sad moment, because it's a beautiful moment they share with the elves. However, imagine Middle-earth with no elves. It seems like a half of a fantasy world, like something is missing. But it's this continual promise that will be echoed throughout the rest of the story, that the elves are leaving, and all the magic and wonder that they bring with them is going as well. They come to Rivendell, and there's a single point of refuge in this journey as they continue on through the dead husk of dwarven glory of Moria. The once great legendary dwarven kingdom is now housing an entire endless legion of goblin horrors, not to mention the Balrog itself. And they continue on. They arrive at Lothlorien, which again stands out in this world, but again, we know this is temporary. Galadriel and Celeborn will be leaving. This is all temporary. This will not last. This world of Middle-earth that they're fighting so hard to protect isn't going to be the same. And they leave Lothlorien, Boromir dies, and the party splits apart, and Merry and Pippin head off and find Treebeard, or are found by Treebeard, and they get to see the Ents and their glory in this wonderful world of peace and just of nature. But then what does Treebeard tell them? He tells them about the Entwives, how they've lost the Entwives, and there's this echoing sadness of, his people are falling asleep. They're forgetting what it means to be the Ents, the shepherds of the trees. They're forgetting, and there's no more young Entlings. There's no more. And of course, what do? When they're finally roused to action, the last march of the Ents, it's this triumphant revenge upon Sauron, who's betrayed them and murdered so many of these people. Treebeard, some of these trees were my friends. And it's this horrible realization, but this triumphant march, but at the same time, it's the last march of the Ents, and it's this continual pairing that Lord of the Rings does, where there's this rise up against evil, but at the same point, there's this price that has to be paid. Again, for the Middle-earth that we're fighting for, it's no longer going to be there. But again, they are victorious. They rout Sauron out. They destroy the Uruk-hai, and they completely destroy them and take over. But there's this question, what kind of Middle-earth will be waiting for them if they remain victorious, if they're able to make it out to the end? When we first learn of Rohan, it falls into the classic example of a fallen kingdom. The king himself, Theoden, has lost his mind, his own son is dead, and Theoden himself is poisoned by Saruman and Wormtongue, but he isn't aware enough to realize what's going on. The entire kingdom is being raided and attacked by enemies on all sides, and yet he does nothing. The people live in fear. They're being murdered. Eomer is banished, the one man trying to hold it all together. Eowyn is afraid in her own house and mourns the slow death of a man she loves like a father. The great horse lords are no more. It's what makes Theoden's return so amazing. He comes back, takes control of his kingdoms, defends his people against Saruman's army, leads a great charge against the army assaulting Gondor to their aid, and it's this great return to what he once was. And while it is this beautiful moment, and we see the echo of what Theoden is as a king, what happens at the end on Pelennor Fields? He dies. And so it's like this legend, this returning legend, then falls to the side. And, he goes to the rescue of Gondor. Gondor itself is completely falling apart. Gondor is a kingdom without a king. A fact painfully obvious, as while they are holding, they are slowly dying and losing on all fronts. From outside, Osgiliath, once the greatest city of men, is crumbling to pieces. Mordor continues to advance. Minas Morgul, once known as Minas Ithil, is now a fortress of evil and dark sorcery. Boromir, their hope, their shining hope, is dead. Faramir is detested by his own father, who's losing grip on reality and seemingly giving into hopelessness of everything. And now they're coming against the combined might of Umbar, Harad, and Mordor itself now marches against them. And it seems the end is near. All hope is lost. And this is what makes these battles so good. For Rohan and Helm's Deep, they are fighting for the existence of their own kingdom that is about to be snuffed out forever. All memory of that noble lineage will be gone. For Gondor, they are the last barrier to Mordor. Once they fall, we understand what will happen. The elves will slowly retreat and turn home. They will leave Middle-earth to fend for itself. In the north, there's no other kingdom of man. There's no great leaders. We only see echoes of the once great kings. But now, there's nothing. Nothing but a hope that we will see another king perhaps return. The dwarves are completely just isolated and working on their own thing. No one's there to help. And this is, again, we have that twin pairing going on. The tragedy of the fallen world with the hope that there's someone who can return Middle-earth to its glory. We see the fallenness of Rohan, of Gondor, and long for it to return, to see the echoes of these great kingdoms of man, the true heroes to rise up. But again, we're going through this land. See what Merry and Pippin go through with the Ents, with Moria, with the Elves. Everything is this fallen nature of this world where everything is collapsing all around them, and they're given this single hope, this bare chance of hope that they can return to this great kingdom. This is what makes Tolkien's world feels so different, is we long for heroes. We want the heroes to return, the great kings of old to come to rise up, to see what it could be, what the great kingdoms were at the height of their glory, the wonder of the elves and their beauty. We want that world. But this is the crazy part, is despite the fact of how hard we're fighting, how hard the heroes are fighting, that world will never return. The kingdoms of old are gone. They could have new kingdoms, but the elves will be gone. The dwarves are retreating into the hills. The Ents are falling apart. They're falling asleep. They're never, seemingly never to return. It's this bittersweet fight that we have to engage in to keep Saruman back. But we do have hope. We have Aragorn. We have Éomer. We have Gimli. We have Legolas. And we have this hope that they can lead their people into a new era. But at the same time, we know that the Middle-earth of the past will never return. And at the end of it all, the Fellowship manages to hold everything together. Frodo manages to destroy the ring, and Gollum comes through in the end despite all the odds. Aragorn then leads the last charge of man against the full might of Mordor, and the Fellowship goes their separate ways. Good triumphs, but even in this amazing victory, the Fellowship splits apart. They go their separate ways, which we knew they were going to. Bilbo, Frodo, Gandalf, and the elves, they're leaving Middle-earth never to return. And you have this heartbreaking goodbye between Sam and Frodo, as they're never going to see each other again. They've gone through so much. It feels so tragic to have to say goodbye like this, but there's no other option. They have to go. They're leaving the land. So Sauron has been defeated, but the ending is still heartbreaking. It's one of the ways the trilogy stands apart from The Hobbit, which ends like a classic adventure story with a much more happily ever after fitting ending. Tolkien takes us through this world and people and history that once were great and does such a good job that we long for it to return. But on the flip side, this feeling is paired with the hope that maybe we could return there. The great kings and leaders could return, and then we see that happen. Theoden, Éomer, Aragorn, Faramir, these leaders rise up trying to revive their tragically fallen kingdoms and fight against evil running rampant. We're seeing this while learning and hearing of the stories of the great kings of old. It causes the audience, we beg for a new king, a new leader, someone who can return the world to the greatness from long ago. And this is what makes Middle-earth so enticing. We, the reader, we want to live in those kingdoms. We want to see and live among the glory of the great kings. We want to see the glory of Moria return, the great dwarven halls glistening with gold and the sound of hammers, the white towers of Gondor, shining out as a beacon of hope, the ruins of Arnor reunited with Gondor, the beauty of the elves and their majesty and the music and everything. We want this world, but we know it can't be. Despite all that we're fighting for, the world is changing, and it's this bittersweet goodbye. And we knew it was always going to be this way, because we knew from the beginning the elves were going to be leaving. We knew that the fellowship was never going to stay together, but they had to split and go their separate ways. But when it comes to it, and you're watching Frodo and them leave on those ships from the Grey Havens, it's a heartbreaking goodbye that they have to say, because we know they'll never see each other again. The Middle Earth that we fought so hard to return peace to will never be the same. Will never be like we imagined it, we wanted it to be. And this is what makes it so bittersweet, because it feels real. This tragedy gives it this historic and realistic weight to it that makes that punch at the end just completely knock us off our feet. And it's what makes us value the time you have together and value the restoration that we know is coming. Seeing what Aragorn is going to do with the kingdom and the land, and how he's going to build a new kingdom worthy of the glory of the kings of old. Thanks for watching. For everyone who made it this far, thanks again. You guys make it worth it. I do these for fun and mostly for myself, but I do really appreciate anyone who stops by to take a look and see and maybe enjoy it for themselves. Please do like and subscribe. It really helps out with the algorithm, and I really appreciate it personally. I read all the comments, go through it. So again, I appreciate all y'all's time. I know it's very valuable, so I hope I haven't wasted it. And please comment below, what your favorite parts, the parts you love the most about Lord of the Rings. I love to talk about it and love to hear from you guys. And I'll see you in the next one.